What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now. I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Welcome to episode 10 in season 2 of Real Democracy Now, a podcast. Today my guest is Professor John Keane. John is a professor of politics at the University of Sydney and at the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin. He is also the co-founder and director of the Sydney Democracy Network. He is renowned globally for his creative thinking about democracy and is the author of The Life and Death of Democracy, as well as writing democracy field notes for The Conversation. Today I talk with Professor Keane about his book, The Life and Death of Democracy, and in particular the concept of monitory democracy, which he develops in this book based on over 10 years' empirical research into the history and practices of democracy. So thanks so much for joining me today, John. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Can you tell us how you came about writing the book, what monitory democracy is, and how it relates to representative democracy?
When beginning to try to write a history of democracy, a new history of democracy, I was sure that I should try to write it democratically. That is, that the narrative should be what Umberto Eco famously called an open text rather than a closed text. That is, it should allow enough room for readers to experience a sense of wonder about the whole topic, but also to encourage them to ask their own questions about democracy rather than, moralizing or sermonizing at them. And on that basis, set out doing field work and research and the beginning of sketches, and came to see in the early stages of the book that the earliest democracies, which I came to call assembly democracies, were rather different than most of the textbooks have claimed, and came up with the idea in the early part of the book and tried to write it that defining feature of democracy in the ancient world was self-government of people, typically men, in a public space, in polities that are small city-states. So democracy is self-government of equals, where deciding and having things decided for you simultaneously is what democracy, demokratia as the Greeks called it, is all about. So democracy is founded on the assembly as the basic unit of decision-making, and it's guided by the principle of equality. And I came to see with my reading and researches and having research assistants help me in a number of languages that actually the assembly form is much older than Athens or the Greek world, and actually has its roots in the cities of ancient Syria, Mesopotamia, so cities like Nippur and Babylon and so on, where up to 2,000 years before they were practiced in Athens, assemblies functioned, they were born and have a history. I also became interested in where the word democracy came from. We don't know who first used it in Greek, demokratia, but what we have, thanks to archaeologists, is a whole rich discussion about Linear B, which is a language that was only decoded in the early 1950s. And the Linear A, which still hasn't been decoded. And Linear B contains a family of terms like damos, for instance, that are very clearly interconnected with the later Greek understandings of words, a family of terms surrounding democracy. So that was, in a way, the easy part. I mean, telling about phase one, called assembly democracy, but trying to change the picture, suggesting that the origins of democracy are Eastern and not Western, the beginning of Western civilization. and writing differently about the role of women in these early democracies, the origin of assemblies, the origin of the very language of democracy. So that came to be part one, so to say, of my project. Then the problem was, the standard narrative was democracy dies, it disappears for 1,000 years and is reborn in the American and the French revolutions, and the rest is history. And typically, according to this view, the early modern revolutions, 1776, 1789, are the moments of birth of what today is called liberal democracy. So there's a continuity from the end of the 18th century. Actually, as I did more and more work, I became more and more confused about about that orthodoxy, and came to doubt it. Doubt it because it left out the Muslim world, it left out the whole medieval European contribution to modern so-called liberal democracy. For example, parliaments are a medieval invention. They are not a modern liberal invention, and so on. And so in the narrative I was constructing, attempt to write democratically about democracy, I set out to complicate the orthodox model, and then came to the period of representative democracy. There was indeed something of a paradigm revolution that happened in the last quarter of the 18th century, and it happened in the Atlantic region. So the center of gravity of democracy shifts from the Mesopotamia, Syria, Greek, Phoenician world to the Atlantic region. And it's in that period that we don't know who first coined it, but in several languages, including French and English and German, for instance, there is born the idea that the ancients had assembly democracy, but we moderns have a new form of democracy that includes the principle of representation. And the new fangled definition of democracy that is born of the last quarter of the 18th century is one that runs something like this. Democracy is self-government of a people inside a territorial framework, a much larger territorial framework than the city-states of the ancient world. Democracy is self-government of a people through their elected representatives. Now, that seems obvious to us, and it's still a meaning that circulates today, and it's argued over, and it's fought for. Blood is shed. There are fears that it can be destroyed. But the ancient Greek world did not have, for example, even a word for representation, so they couldn't think of democracy in this sense. So, in this grand but democratic narrative, trying to recover memory of the history of democracy, I came to think that this phase two, the invention of representative democracy and its peculiar meanings, and a whole bundle of new institutions that were born as part of this innovation, that this came to grip gradually parts of the world, and beginning in the Atlantic region from the end of the 18th century through roughly to World War I and into the 1920s. And I tried to examine in detail all of the innovations that happened. This is the period in which the secret ballot is invented, and election commissions, and where for the first time there is talk of the importance of enfranchisement of women, of slaves, of workers, and so on. And then I hit a brick wall because the question was, what became of this representative democracy during the 1920s and 30s and beyond? Well, it's pretty well documented by historians that those decades, immediately after World War I, the first global war, are decades that are very unkind to representative democracy. And to put it very simply, by 1945, at the end of yet another global war, and concentration camps and aerial bombardment and the bomb, there are only 12 representative democracies left on the face of the earth. It became an endangered species, and we could have a long discussion about how it survived, but it survived with very great difficulty. Most of the experiments after World War I, the Wilsonian vision of the flourishing of democracies in territorial states, where elections are the centerpiece of democracy, that vision came crashing to the ground due to a whole variety of lethal forces. I hit a wall in trying to finish the book, because the question was, how to describe, how to narrate the much more recent history of democracy. And every historian knows that the history that's closest to us is the history which is the most difficult to narrate. And I had a few options. I could have told the story through the Sam Huntington, Francis Fukuyama narrative. That would be basically the story of the ascendancy, slowly but surely, of American-style liberal representative democracy, where free and fair elections are the central organizing principle of democracy, with a set of institutions such as rule of law and nation-state sovereignty and so on, an active civil society, a free press. And to my great surprise, I was reading and collecting and traveling, collecting materials and traveling, doing field work. I went to many countries, and I began to spot a very large anomaly in the question, in the orthodoxy. That is, I came to see that there's a whole series of institutions that function as power monitors, as power scrutinizing institutions, as power restraining institutions. More than 100 of these I came to see by developing this, that were born in the post-1945 period that never existed before in the history of democracy. And I came to wonder about their significance. Examples. The birth of and the marriage of human rights networks, where the languages of democracy and human rights conjoin, and where the argument is made that every democracy needs human rights codes, and that human rights networks have the goal of pushing and defending human rights for the sake of democracy. That is something new in the history of democracy. I then began to look at cases such as the civil rights movement in America in the early 1950s, and I came to see that this remarkable refusal of a form of apartheid in the American South happened and was given energy by the invention of a whole set of power restraining mechanisms, power scrutinizing mechanisms that, again, never existed before. Freedom rights, sing-ins, sit-ins. These kinds of non-violent mechanisms designed to defeat a system of organized discrimination against black people was something new, or so I thought. And I began then to look at cases outside of the Atlantic region. India, I visited India a number of times. I came to see them full of these new mechanisms. For example, the Gandhian nonviolent satyagraha, or railway courts in Mumbai, self-managing the railway system, or fiercely fought student elections, or local religious courts. And I began to become very confused about what all of these mechanisms never had existed before in the history of democracy meant. And I became convinced that it was that these were global. These are not Atlantic, or so to say, European inventions. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are a Central American invention that was famously publicized in the South African case. And today, there's a Truth and Dignity Commission operating in Tunisia. So I began to think about the problem of how to narrate this post-1945 period. And at first I bumblingly used the language of complex democracy. It didn't seem to capture. Words count in democracy, and they count in politics, and they count in the narration of history. Then I came for a while to use post-representative democracy, and I found that caused quite a lot of confusion. But I came to see that what I was trying to name, what I was trying to understand conceptually and contextually, was a transformation of democracy in this post-1945 period that is global, a transformation of meaning of democracy, so that democracy has come to mean, it seems to me, nothing less than free and fair elections, periodically, but something much more. And the something much more has to do with developing an ecology of institutions that flank elections and parties and so on, parliaments, institutions whose raison d'etre, whose functional purpose is the scrutiny of power, the public scrutiny of power, opening up power, demanding accountability of those who exercise power wherever power is exercised. And so democracy came to mean, slowly but surely, with many setbacks to be sure, it came to mean free and fair elections plus the permanent public scrutiny of and restraint of power, of arbitrary power, in the name of the equality principle and driven by the contingency principle. And to complete the picture, I found myself in dialogue with a friend and a great scholar of communications, Michael Schudson, who is today at Columbia University, who had, in a very, very good book on the history of citizenship in the United States, coined the phrase monitorial citizen. And I began talking with him about that and thought that it was a bit of a mouthful and strange, but it was a clue that I then followed up, and I began to look into the genealogy of this old-fashioned word monitor, or words monitor, monitory. Of course, we have computer monitors, but actually the origins of the term, it turns out, is traceable to medieval Europe, to the church, where a monitory or a monitor is a letter which is sent by someone in the church to someone else elsewhere in the church, warning them not to do something because it's risky or ungodly or evil or whatever, or admonishing them to do something because it's a good thing to do. And I came to then look at the evolution of the term. We have monitory lizards, for instance, who warn humans of the approach of predators. And I came to think that old-fashioned term, monitor, monitory, was exactly what I had been looking for some time. So was coined the phrase monitory democracy. In some languages, it's very easy to translate. It goes very well into Spanish, democracia monitorizada. In Mandarin, 监督式民主. Every time I've talked in China, people immediately get what you're talking about. A form of democracy in which the scrutiny and restraint publicly of power is what democracy is all about. Abuse of power is the antithesis of democracy. In some languages, German, for example, which is one of my languages, it's very difficult to translate and easily gets entangled with talk of surveillance, which is not what I mean. Surveillance is a kind of private spying, an institutional private spying on others and keeping that material so gathered secretive. That's what a CCTV system does, and where the materials are released in court if they happen to be relevant in a trial, for instance. But public monitoring of power is different. It means that actors in institutional settings, for example, in a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or tribunal, that actors in an institutional setting engage in the public scrutiny of power in the case of such commissions, asking questions publicly through the media in a kind of trial, asking questions about who was responsible for the great violence or the disappearances of the ancien regime, which has been overthrown, as in South Africa, let's say, or as in Tunisia today. So this was a very long-winded summary of how over a decade I was forced to grapple with how to narrate its history. And I hit upon this idea of monitory democracy because it seems to me it resonates better with a sea change that is taking place, a change in the spirit and language of democracy, slowly but surely, that helps us better understand things that are going on and what is at stake. Some parts of the world are at the moment preoccupied with what the long-term significance of the election of Donald Trump is. And the misgivings and the anxiety, as I see it from this perspective, are centrally to do with the fact that he shows the first signs of wanting to dismantle institutions that scrutinize presidential power, stacking the judiciary, sacking the director of the FBI, trying to tame the media, removing scientists from bodies, dismantling centers of expertise and monitoring inside government institutions. I mean, all of this is an attempt, seen from this perspective, to weaken and perhaps permanently weaken and destroy monitory democracy. And note that you can do all this through winning elections. Perhaps it's worth saying, if I may, just one last thing about this theory of monitory democracy and how I came to it. I was very struck by the 1940s discussion about the future of democracy. I've mentioned that in 1945, as a political form, representative democracy was in very dire straits. You were lucky if you were living in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, very lucky if you were living in Britain and or the United States. But if you were Polish or Czech or Slovak or Russian, German, you were aware that something had been destroyed, devastated by war and by armed force and so on. And it was in that decade I began to collect materials in as many languages as I could manage with the help of research assistants too. It was in that decade, 1940 to 1950, that the last great discussion about democracy, its meaning, and its future took place. And I was very struck by the way across the political spectrum from, for example, Catholic conservatives like Jacques Maritain, who became very involved in human rights politics, at one end of the spectrum, through to, say, George Orwell on the left, called himself a socialist, that across the spectrum, journalists, intellectuals, public figures, politicians, despite their differences of opinion, were agreed that there was something pathological, something self-destructive about representative democracy, born of the 18th century and defined essentially by free and fair elections model. And the pathological or the self-destructive dynamic, so they said, observed. Of course, with Hitler in mind, is that it would be possible for a party to win a majority of seats in a parliament that would destroy democracy and would do so in the name of the people. And so those who reflected on the fate and the future of democracy during that period became convinced that democracy, understood as electoral democracy, had to be made more complicated. And the way to do it was to flank elections by countervailing institutions that would redefine democracy so that it had built into its very ideals a sense of complexity, the importance of plurality, and so on. And it seems to me that it seemed to me at the time that 1940s discussion was very important for setting the agenda for so much institutional innovation that subsequently happened. And I believe that we are still living in this era of monitory democracy. And I think it is not, it's not a Western or European phenomenon, that its spirit and its language and institutions are alive in India, in Indonesia, in Taiwan, as much as they are in Chile or, let's say, in Mexico or Colombia, as they are in Canada, the United States, and, of course, the ailing European Union. I'm sorry for the...
That was great. I've got 2 follow-up questions. So when you were first talking about your empirical work and finding these, you spoke sort of really about, I guess, human rights organisations and new mechanisms, which the examples you gave to me appeared to be predominantly examples based in civil society, and then you moved on to perhaps more official organisations. I just wondered how you see those working together or not, particularly when the example you gave of Trump seeking to dismantle the formal institutions that have been set up to scrutinise the president. And we know here in Australia, just in New South Wales, where we both live, about some of the attacks on the independence of the Independent Commission Against Corruption.
Sure.
One of the things I wonder about is if you've got institutions that are set up by Parliament, how can you ensure that they continue to hold power to account?
Well, that's a political and practical question, and it depends on the context. But let's go back to the first part of your question. The way I conceive monitory democracy and think about its history since the 1940s, when I think a rupture happened, is that it's a new form, historically speaking, it's a new form of democracy, of power-sharing democracy, power-restraining democracy in the name of people, flesh and blood people, driven by the equality principle. Probably the most vibrant, when it works well, the most vibrant form of democracy that humans have ever known. I think of it in terms of sets of institutions that are both governmental and non-governmental. An illustration. One of the first breakthroughs in this 1940s, early 1950s period is the insistence. You can see it in the German constitution and you can see it in the new Indian constitution. The insistence that hereon democracy is married to rule of law principles. That a written constitution that is, so to say, higher than any elected government, which any elected government has to observe and respect, a written constitution that guarantees rights of citizens as equals of that republic, that polity. That was an example, a very early example of a transformation of meaning of democracy, where an independent judiciary and a written constitution, where rule of law are all mechanisms that are bound up with democracy and not, so to say, its enemy, as Trump tried to say right at the very beginning of his presidency, so-called judges, that sarcastic phrase. Other institutions monitory democracy that have been invented since the late 1940s. You mentioned human rights networks. I gave the example of the civil rights movement in America. Other institutions come from below, so to say. They come from the domain of civil society. And there are many, many examples of this. You can see this today in the field, let's say, of environmental politics, food sovereignty movements, the development of participatory budgeting schemes where citizens are directly involved from below in the decisions about budgeting, say, in cities, are examples. And then a whole clutch of these monitory institutions that straddle the government-civil society divide, so to say. And there are lots of instances of this. I could think of, you mentioned independent commissions against corruption. They are probably an Australian invention from the 1970s, but there are many global examples of this, where they act as hybrid institutions where civil society actors take cases into these institutions that draw government into, and supervision and accountability of government into the proceedings. So it's not, monitory democracy is not it's not a phenomenon of civil society, and there are many hybrid institutions, and there are many mechanisms that have been invented by governments in this post-1945 period designed to restrain governmental power itself. I think, Freedom of Information Acts, the first one is in the United States, or budget supervisory bodies. These are examples where governments come to see the need for public scrutiny of their own, independent public scrutiny of their own power. The second part of the question I've forgotten.
I suppose the second part was around the government, such as the example you gave with Trump, being able to actually, if they have established these institutions, they can disband them.
Yes, and we are living through times where there are organized efforts in a number of contexts to dismantle monitory institutions, both within government, within civil society, and in the in-between spaces. I'm thinking here of the rise of what I'm calling the new despotisms of the 21st century, and I'm completing a book on this topic. Take the example of Orban's Hungary. This is a small country inside the European Union. It's strategically significant. It made a transition from the Soviet Empire into an era of free and fair elections and the growth of a whole variety of monitory institutions. It was on the path to becoming something of a textbook monitory democracy. And what has been going on in Hungary, as you know, and anybody who follows this feels a measure of deep anxiety. What is going on under the Orban administrations, winning multiple elections in the name of the Hungarian people and so on, is an organized dismantling of countervailing public monitoring institutions. So the Orban government has tamed the independent judiciary that existed. It has colonized mainstream media, radio and television and newspapers. It is stacking the bureaucracy with basically patronage appointments. It gets its own men and women into positions. And as we know from recent news, it is now in the process of attempting to dismantle the Central European University, an institution of civil society that is funded by a bequest from, or a large grant from George Soros. And this transition which is happening, one Hungarian sociologist, scholar, Magyar, is calling it a mafia state. I prefer the word despotism for reasons that don't so much matter here, but here's an example where the Hungarian model shows how you dismantle a monitory democracy in the name of the people. And this, for me, provides a clue about a bigger trend of our times, which is the resurgence of populism, last seen on a large scale in the 1920s and 1930s, where it had very destructive effects on parliamentary representative democracy. Populism is, so to say, it's a revenge. It's the autoimmune disease of monitory democracy. It's a revenge against a form of democracy where winning elections, those who win elections, have to respect a plurality of power-checking institutions, including independent courts and independent media. This populism tries to simplify and to destroy that ecology of monitoring institutions. And we don't know whether it's going to succeed, but we already have cases, the Hungarian, the Polish case, Belarus, the Central Asian republics. There are many examples of where a power-sharing constitutional monitory democracy is actually dismantled in the name of the people, in the name of democracy.
Finally, another follow-up question. Your description of monitory democracy very much is about holding power to account, restraining power. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on where sharing power, and I'm thinking here of literature in the area of participatory democracy, where does that fit within a monitory democracy?
Yes, since the 1960s, the idea that the people should decide for themselves, how they're going to live in common, all power to the people, the SDS famous pamphlet, the Port Huron statement that democracy must become again participatory democracy, that citizens need to be involved as equals in deciding how they're going to live in common, and that whenever they're affected by decisions, they have the right to be involved. I think if you think historically about this participatory, this fascination with and experiments with participatory democracy, you see that actually it is a component of this historical shift that I'm trying to grasp in terms of this category of monitory democracy. And it's true that, it's seen in this way, deliberative democracy. It was all the flavor of for many intellectuals and think tanks and some philanthropic funders in the past decade, that deliberative democracy belongs to the age of monitory democracy and has given rise to new institutions such as deliberative forums or citizens' juries or citizens' assemblies that count as one of this 100 or so or more sets of innovations that belong to the era of monetary democracy. My problem intellectually and politically with this deliberative democracy is, there are several reasons. I think it doesn't understand itself historically very well. I think it has a certain nostalgia built into it for the imagined ancient Greek world. There are many experiments with these deliberative assemblies which suppose that we could again become Greek. We could again become like the gatherings that took place at the Pnyx in Athens, where 5,000 or 6,000 male citizens gathered in public as equals, and through shows of hands and vigorous debating, they decided on courses of action. Would they accept this tax? Would they go to war? Would there be peace, or what have you? And I think, furthermore, that the problem I have with participatory democracy is its presumption that representation can be eliminated from democracy. As I see it, what monitory democracy does is it makes spaces, new spaces for peoples to be involved in deciding things for themselves. That's for sure, and that's of course, one of its important features. But it does so by pluralizing the understanding of representation. And it sees the need for representation in politics and the advantages of representation. So monitory democracy effectively means that elected representation is only one form of representation. You can have other forms of unelected representation that are functionally very important for the health and the viability of democracy. I know that the phrase unelected representatives grates on the ears of many Democrats, but think of a truth and reconciliation tribunal, which lasts for a year or some months or maybe several years. What is going on in this public forum where people are encouraged to speak about their suffering, where those who committed crimes are, without fear of incarceration, are also asked to speak about the crimes they committed and to say sorry? What is going on in these public forums? Well, it's not understandable as participatory democracy. There's all kinds of representations of the past and so on that are unelected, and yet it's a very powerful mechanism for taming power, for coming to terms with the arbitrary power of the old regime and ensuring that it doesn't happen again. So I think that the whole issue of representation is very poorly addressed. I mean, the ideal is that people themselves, if they're affected by an issue, ought face-to-face to be involved. That is, of course, it's practically very difficult. And it's why, I think, in those contexts where the talk of a new form of democracy, real democracy understood as participatory democracy, that in those contexts they quickly morphed into a much more complex and actually headed in the direction of monitory democracy. Spain is a very good example. I've just finished, and it's soon to appear in English. It's appeared in Spanish, to publish with a couple of Spanish colleagues and a colleague here in Sydney, a book on M15, which I think shows that the birth of that movement against La Casta, against corruption of the banks, the two-party system, that in the first movement there was lots of talk of real democracy, of people taking power into their own hands, of participatory democracy. And it morphed under pressure from the realization of the complexity of politics and the need for representation and the need to supplement winning elections with power restraining mechanisms. It morphed into a Spanish form of democracia monitorizada, I think. And so that's briefly my reflection on the Greek, the nostalgia for becoming Greek again that is built in to the idea of participatory democracy.
Some of the people I've spoken to earlier in season 2 have focused on using the internet to go back to a more direct form of democracy. And, it's got a range of names: liquid democracy, fluid democracy, that sort of thing. So, there's certainly, which is a new form of participatory democracy, I guess, rather, than the traditional models, which were more sort of town hall meetings and so on. So.
Yeah, I could give you the example. It's a very early innovation in the history of monitory democracy. I give you the example of co-determination in the workplace, which it's in German, it's Mitbestimmung. And it's born of the 1940s, the late 1940s, and it's still alive and well in the German economy today. So any firm that has a certain number of employees by law is required to allow the growth inside that firm of a system of elections where workers elect representatives who sit on the governing boards of the companies who employ them. And I write about this in the Life and Death of Democracy book. It has a very ironic history, championed by the British and designed in the reconstruction of Germany after its military defeat in 1945. It was introduced for the purpose of destroying the remnants of Nazism inside German coal and steel industry and in other sectors. And it took root. You could say that it is a form of participatory democracy, that periodically the employees, considered as equals inside that firm, are entitled to vote by secret ballot as equals. They participate in a discussion about how they want this company to be run. But in action, co-determination requires the election of representatives. And so one has a form of representative rather than just simply participatory democracy. But when you think about it in terms of the ecology of democracy in a country such as Germany, itself inside the European Union, this Mitbestimmung system, this co-determination system that operates within firms in a market economy, are themselves only one element, one ingredient, one node, if you like, in a much more complex infrastructure of forms of representation, in addition to the general elections that happen and the elections that happen at the state level. So the idea of monitory democracy is that what happens is a pluralization of forms of representation. Democracy comes to mean not just the centrality of the elected representative in free and fair elections that happen periodically. Democracy comes to mean that plus the election, the choosing of representatives in a whole variety of other settings where people are directly involved in deciding on those representatives. Parent-teacher bodies, councils, governing councils inside professions, representative mechanisms inside the WHO or inside bodies like the Forestry Stewardship Council. I mean, there are many examples where the point I'm making is that the ecology of participation and representation is not understandable in classical Greek assembly democracy terms, and not understandable in the terms that the Democrats from the end of the 18th century through to the 1920s understood democracy. Something more complicated, something messier, something much more puzzling has been born, and that's what I try to do in my work, to try better to understand its architecture, and its dynamics, its self-paralyzing trends, the reason why monitory democracy may be, it needs new justifications for why it's a good thing, and to peer into the distance to speculate on the future of democracy. I think it's a term that helps us come to terms with the contingency of our own times, for the novelty of our own times. We are not living anymore in liberal democracies. It's a zombie phrase, and we are not living in the ancient Greek world, and our forms of democracy are different than our grandparents or great-grandparents experienced, if they were lucky to experience democracy.
I liked that. It's a zombie phrase. That's lovely. Can I just ask, you've described in detail how you came, through your field work, you came to identify these monitory institutions, and you just mentioned then about arguments to support them. So how did you move from sort of a purely empirical discovery, I guess, to what I sense is now a normative perspective on the value that this sort of democracy has?
Yes, it's a very interesting and very important question. I mean, partly I did it by lining up the repertoires of justifications of democracy historically, and I've given the example of the way that the classical Athenian Democrats thought of it in imperialist terms. It's very shocking for us. Democracy helps us win wars. Josiah Ober has tried to revive that idea. He's a Greek classic scholar. Compared that with, the anti-slavery Democrats who thought that God was on the side of democracy. And I could give you, many other illustrations of that. The point is that the normative justifications, the ethical justifications for democracy that we've inherited are mostly exhausted. They no longer make sense. For example, I don't think that the Karl Popper, in his Open Society and Its Enemies, a book written in New Zealand during the Second World War, that the Karl Popper view that the great thing about democracy and the open society that it requires is that it enables truth, durable truth, to surface, not only in the field of science, but also in the field of public discussion and debate through parliamentary politics. I think this is a very questionable, very contestable attempted justification of democracy. It's a long discussion, but simply because one of the things that this age of monitory democracy does is pluralize truths. It encourages people and their representatives to become more ironic, to see the need to understand others' points of view. Democracy comes to be the great protector, monitory democracy, the great protector of difference, of equality within difference. The rights of the disabled, the rights of non-heterosexual peoples, the entitlement of the biosphere to be represented in human affairs, that humans should not destroy their ecosystems and so on. So I was confronted in the last couple of decades when thinking about normative justifications of democracy, of asking, of being forced to ask myself, are there some new arguments that you can make publicly, intellectually, of course, but publicly, that have a bite, new arguments for why democracy, in this case monetary democracy, is important and possibly even a universal. And the moment where, in trying to write this history of democracy, I had something of an epiphany, was reading an essay by the great Irish man of letters, C.S. Lewis, famous for his children's stories and so on. In the darkest moment of World War II, he, Catholic, skeptical, pretty depressed by what's going on in Europe, asks the question, is it still possible to be a Democrat? And if so, why should one be a Democrat? And what he says in this wonderful essay, and he's not the only one, in that 1940s discussion, this argument infuses more or less the whole political spectrum. His argument is, up until now, we've believed that people are good and they're capable of governing themselves, and that democracy is, a triumph of the goodness of human beings, that where human beings are good enough to act as the equals of others, and that no tyrant, or certainly no despot, no church, no monarch should rule us. And Lewis says, I look around me and I see great evils, and I see destruction, and I see bombardment, I see the destruction of cities. He knew, he had the first inklings of the concentration camps, of organized murder, and so on. And he says, but despite all of this, I remain a Democrat. And you know why I'm a Democrat? He asked. I'm a Democrat because actually all this evil is, for me, proof that human beings can be extremely cruel to one another. And because they're extremely cruel, there is no reason for trusting anybody with concentrated power. That is, nobody is good enough on earth to govern others because of the great evils and the predations and the destruction of others that they're capable of. And so I'm a Democrat, says Lewis, because it's the only mechanism we have, it's the only way of life, it's the only way of handling power through sets of institutions, through a way of life, through a spirit, through a language. It's the only, so far, way we've come up with to restrain the evils of arbitrary power. And the most famous version of this is Churchill's speech in the House of Commons, where he says, many forms of government have been invented. None of them are perfect, but this one is better than any others, even though it's not perfect. Orwell's From Homage of Catalonia through to Animal Farm to 1984 is infused with this spirit, that the great dangers of arbitrary power that the 20th century is now being confronted with, and we're living in times that still lives with even more dangers and great evils of power. One of the great works of this period, in which C.S. Lewis wrote and contributed to a refashioning of the key argument for democracy, is a wonderful book called The Children of Light and the Children of Darkness by Reinhold Niebuhr. Niebuhr was the teacher of Martin Luther King. Obama often praised him. And in this book, published in, I think, 1945, he too reflects on what's happened to democracy. And he says, basically, until now, Democrats, he's thinking about liberal parliamentary Democrats, have been really naive. We see how naive they have been. They supposed that history was on their side, that democracy would triumph. There were many exponents of that view, Niebuhr points out. And he notes, looking at what is happening globally, both in Asia and in Europe, he notes that this liberal democratic optimism is now exhausted. And what we need, says Niebuhr in this wonderful book, is a much tougher understanding, a new, fresh understanding of democracy and why it's a good thing. And again, it is the evils of arbitrary power with which he's centrally concerned, which he thinks is is something like the quintessence of the spirit of democracy, and which require, as Niebuhr points out, C.S. Lewis thought this too, it requires a shift from the understanding of democracy as centrally to do with free and fair elections to a political form where there is a whole ecology of institutions that can prevent evils of power. Rule of law through independent judiciaries is a case in point. And I have come to see that in this period since the 1940s, there is a sort of big intellectual shift that has taken place in many fields in favor of this view. Wittgenstein is among my favorite post-philosophers. I've written recently about his last work on certainty. And what Wittgenstein comes to is the view that, the world is extremely complex, and we should be more humble in the way that we think about the world and claim to know the world. He even proposes, Wittgenstein in this last work, in an aphorism, he says, imagine a society where instead of saying, I know this, or we're required to say, I believe, and to use the preface, I believe I know. Here is the idea that I'm going on about, that democracy is the carrier of humility, that the virtue of humility, of self-restraint of power, of the refusal of arbitrary power, of respect for the great complexity of our world, including the world of the non-human. I mean, these are the virtues, so to say, that crystallized and have crystallized and seem to me to be very much at the heart of monitory democracy. And of course, feeding both the contingency principle that I spoke about and, of course, the equalization of power principle. C.S. Lewis, I think, was right. When power and its resources are granted to a few, it becomes clear that one should be careful, one should watch out, one should feel trepidation, because good kings and good queens are few and far between. And the suspicion should now be on arbitrary power, the exponents of arbitrary power. They should be doubted and resisted, because their efforts can result in very great evils. Stupidities, follies. If I may, I have a forthcoming book which is about the future of democracy. It's the sequel, and it's called Humbling the Powerful, and it will be published next year. And in that book, there are some examples given of the dangers of arbitrary power. And they're easy to find, but I was still living in Europe and at this time, and after 2007 through to 2010-11, it's a pretty beginning of a very tumultuous period in the Atlantic region, and I looked at three large organizations. Comparatively, I looked at Lehman Brothers, the oldest bank in the United States that collapsed. I looked at Deepwater Horizon, the most daring deep-sea drilling for oil and gas that had ever taken place. And I looked at Fukushima. I looked at the way that the company called TEPCO handled the earthquake and the tsunami and the meltdown of a reactor and the pollution of a very large area around that reactor system. And what I drilled down into them, so to say, and I collected materials. I began wondering whether their malfunctioning, their collapse, the catastrophes that they produced that affected many millions of people's lives and the ecosystems had anything to do with the way they were governed. And strikingly, this is an allegory of about arbitrary power. Strikingly, all three institutions, Lehman Brothers, BP's Deepwater Horizon project, and TEPCO's Fukushima, all of them were institutions of great power where there was no internal accountability, and where each of those projects, each of those organizations protected themselves against public scrutiny by journalists. TEPCO is a case in point. It had an in-house group of journalists loyal to the company that only put out good news. The internal culture of power was that no bad news was allowed to flow up. And when the catastrophe began, it's not well known that the CEO of TEPCO, actually, the Japanese have an expression, the dog fell in the river. The CEO actually locked himself in his office for 5 nights and into a 6th day. Didn't speak to any employees, didn't speak to the media. I mean, had something of a profound nervous breakdown, which made the handling of the tsunami and the beginning of a meltdown much more difficult to resolve. What is the point? The point is that when you have systems of concentrated power and you do not have built into them monitory democracy mechanisms, then that organization is asking for trouble. Groupthink, folly, silly decisions, risky risks, and outright hubris, as the Greeks called it, tend to settle on those institutions. And that's the point at which they become dangerous. So a new argument for democracy is that it is the best weapon we have in terms of a spirit and language and sets of institutions, the best weapon we have for preventing the folly, the risks, the hubris, and the potential catastrophes of arbitrary power, wherever power is exercised, not only in the field of government, not only in the field of economy, in the field of corporations, but also it's a mark of the novelty of monetary democracy, also in the field of our relations with the biosphere. I think one of the remarkable things, it never happened before in the history of democracy, is the greening of democracy. And by that, I don't mean only the invention of green parties. Australians and New Zealanders clash over who had the first green party. Green parties are new in the history of democracy, but I'm thinking of the way that there are things going on in terms of the revaluing, the redefining of our relationship with the biosphere. For instance, the first constitutions have appeared in Bhutan, in Mongolia, in Bolivia, which specify in writing, written constitutions redefine citizenship in a democracy as requiring humility to the world of biomes in which we dwell and responsibility for the stewardship of those biomes. Or take some really cutting-edge examples, I call them bio-democracies, where whole patches of the earth are, by law and by monitory institutions, are protected from predatory human activities. Though the Wanganui, the declaration of the Wanganui River Basin as having a legal status is a case in point. And in Australia, take the example of Uluru. This is hardly any work has been done on it, but this is an experiment in a new form of monitory democracy where indigenous peoples of the region have legal entitlement to land, where there is a self-governing body that is mainly indigenous to decide on how that park, including Katatuta and Uluru, are governed, where taxes are raised thanks to tourists coming, where the federal government, based in Canberra, sets health and safety standards, and so on, where you have a mixed jurisdiction. You have a polity, if you like, a sub-polity that has no textbook precedence. It's a case of monitory democracy in action where those peoples living in that patch of the earth think of themselves as self-governing and a patch of land that itself is connected to the rest of the planet, and where the function of that form of self-government and representation is to protect, to steward the delicate, vulnerable biomes in which human beings live. I think that, this is a case where the restraint of arbitrary power of human beings over the biosphere, it's an effort to restrain exercise of arbitrary power, where there is, so to say, a democratization of our relationship with biomes. And this would be very surprising for any ancient Greek democrat. It would be very surprising, not understandable for Jacksonian democrats in the 1820s. They just simply wouldn't get it, because they suppose that nature, is a resource that can be exploited and the people are entitled to do that. And that's what a democracy does. Something big has been born. It's unfinished. It's up against tremendous odds. See, with destruction of species and global warming and so on. But this greening of democracy, this invention of many new monitoring institutions designed to protect biomes against human predation is a feature, I think, of this era of monitory democracy. This is a very long-winded way of saying that there is, I think, historically speaking, a new normative justification for why democracy is a good thing. I think it was born of the 1940s. It had earlier antecedents, to be sure, but this new justification of the dangers, of the evils of concentrated power has moved to the heart of democracy as we live it today. And does it have any historical guarantees? No. Can it be destroyed? Yes. We're living in times where there is, I think, rising anxiety that democracy, in the sense I've been speaking about it, not only free and fair elections, but the restraint of arbitrary power through monitory mechanisms, there is a rising sense, an anxiety that this may be being dismantled and that perhaps democracy is dying.
I hope not, but there's certainly this sort of idea that Hitler was elected, and we're yet to see what Trump might do, but certainly he was elected. The next question about the key challenges and what role monitory democracy can play in meeting these.
I think the short answer is that the grave dangers posed to monitory democracy are concentrations of unaccountable power. And I would say, dark money in elections. I would say the development of unprecedented development of a new form of market, so-called market capitalism, which is financial capitalism, where banks and credit institutions have begun to play a central role in the political economies of all democracies, and therefore the risks posed as happened in 2007 and 8. I would say that the great growth of cross-border chains of power that are not publicly restrained and monitored are grave threats to democracy. And I would add, if this isn't worrisome and potentially bleak enough, I would say that we're witnessing a clear alternative form of polity, form of power that is anti-democratic, and I call these the new despotisms. And one case in point, an obvious case in point, is Putinism, Putin's Russia. What kind of polity is this? It's a polity where those who rule at all levels do so in the name of the people. They have periodic elections, which the rulers win. This is a system which has a middle class, which is on balance loyal to the regime. This is a system where there's lots of talk of law, but rule basically happens through law. There's a lawlessness, there's no rule of law. This is a system which is media saturated, a system where repression and censorship of media, including in the internet sphere, is not exactly how it works, but that there are measures of so-called free communication that are allowed because these serve the purpose of disgruntled people venting, but also a certain measure of openness enables those who rule to have early warning detectors built into the communication system. These are systems, Putin's Russia is the case in point, which do not terrorize the whole population, unlike totalitarian regimes of the past. These are systems that camouflage violence, that have targeted violence. And when you put all that together, you have, I think, the birth of something new. I call them despotisms because this is an old word that flourished in particular in the second half of the 18th century to describe a thoroughly modern form of power, top-down power, that did something that many observers thought would be impossible. That is, a form of top-down power that won the loyalty of its subjects. And I think that I've just finished a book on China, which is coming out. I think that these new despotisms of the 21st century are a clear alternative to monitory democracy. They try to destroy the monitory mechanisms. They try to destroy the ecology, the complex ecology of public restraint mechanisms. And when they manage to do that, that's going on in Hungary, then something new is born. And so we are living in times where the problem is not, it seems to me, the resurgence of old-fashioned fascism or old-fashioned Bolshevism, totalitarianism, as Hannah Arendt analyzed it. These regimes are new. This new type of political form, which I'm calling despotism, has new 21st century characteristics. And worryingly, these despotisms have some democratic qualities about them. I put that in quotation marks. They don't crush elections, unlike military dictatorships of the past. They stage them and they win them, and they do so for a variety of reasons. And they all talk the people. Those who rule do so in the name of the people. They all claim that the people are sovereign. Of course, this is a kind of simulation. But so these are despotisms that remind us of the warning of Tocqueville in his great 2-volume Democracy in America, where when peering into the future, he says that one of the things that bothers him about democracy is the possibility that it will give birth to a new kind of enslavement where many peoples favor strong, concentrated state power and feel comfortable in that power, that they experience a kind of voluntary servitude to that power. And this is something that is real, that is happening in Russia, in China. How come Putin remains so popular? How come Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign, according to the opinion polls, reliable that we have, is welcomed by somewhere between 80 and 90% of the population, where the bulk of the Chinese population, again, we have very good data, believe, maybe 80%, that they believe that they're living in a democracy.
Oh, my goodness.
And yet there are no free and fair elections at the top. There are elections at the bottom, at the village level. The question I'm getting at is, the problem I'm getting at is, are we living through a period where there is actually a competitor alternative to monitory democracy, a competitor that has, so to say, democratic qualities about it, but really is in it's on another trajectory that takes us away from a form of democracy that was born of the 1940s and which, became precious for many millions of people, not only in the Atlantic region, but in South Africa and in Indonesia and in India and so on. I think it's one of the very big questions of our time.
Thank you for joining me today. In next week's episode, you'll be hearing from a range of my guests answering the question, if you could change one thing about democracy, what would it be? I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.